Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Shamta Hunter, and on behalf of the Sustainability Hub and the Student Health and Wellbeing at UBC, I would like to welcome you to Emotions and Saving the Planet with Dr. Sarah Ray. I'm joining you today from UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I make this acknowledgement with a deep sense of consideration of the impacts of climate injustices on our Indigenous communities for many years. This sense of urgency and emotional trauma that comes with it is not new to the Indigenous communities who have been feeling the impacts for generations. Their worlds have been disappearing for hundreds of years through residential schooling, the Indian Act, and subsequent policies and programs designed to erase culture and relationships to land. And these traumas continue to manifest through discriminatory child welfare policies, lack of access to clean water, disproportional rates of poverty, discrimination, and genocide of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Indigenous communities have witnessed and felt the emotional trauma of the impacts of industries and resource extraction. Emotions in the context of climate change must be understood through the lens of our colonial history and the continued colonial past. So how do we talk about eco-anxiety or climate anxiety and acknowledge that there has been a lot of trauma tied to the exploitation of land and destruction of place and culture since colonization? I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sarah Ray, who will help us understand some of these connections and impacts on how do we move forward from here. Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray works at the intersection of social justice and climate emotions. And we are very fortunate to have her here with us for a talk right now and an informal community dialogue starting right after our talk. An environmental humanist with BA in religious studies, an MA in American studies, and a PhD in environmental sciences, studies, and policy, Dr. Ray draws on an eclectic range of disciplines and epistemologies in service of climate justice. She's the author of 2 books, The Ecological Other, Environmental Exclusion in American Culture from 2013, on the logic and effects of social control in environmental thought, and a field guide to climate anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet in 2020, an existential toolkit for the climate generation. Dr. Ray is co-hosting a conference in April 2023 on climate justice and the politics of emotion at UC Riverside, co-leads an international network working to develop an existential toolkit for climate justice educators, and co-edited a book by the same name, which is coming out next year. Ray offers a professional development workshop to help center emotions in climate work called the Climate Wisdom Lab, and is a certified mindfulness teacher through the UCLA Mindfulness Awareness Research Center. Dr. Ray has published on emotions and climate justice in the LA Times, Scientific American, the Cairo Review of Global Affairs, Edge Effects, KCET, and Zocalo Public Square. So with that, I will hand it over to Sarah.
Hi. Thank you so much, Shamta. I'm going to turn off my little space heater so that's not so loud down there. I'm sure you all are having the similar kind of weather, kind of cold, and get some snow going and lots of precipitation going. And of course, weather is never small talk anymore. Thank you so much for inviting me, UBC. Thank you so much to all the people in the background here, Nikki and Belen, for all your tech help. And all of you for coming. I really loved your land acknowledgement, Shamta. And what I particularly liked about it was not only did you sort of spell out why to give a land acknowledgement and what's happening to make it so it wasn't just performative, which of course is the issue with them, but you tied it to the talk topic. So that was pretty cool, and I love it. Along those lines, I will have a little. Today's talk is not justice is not the central framework for the talk, but I do have moments where I want to note and kind of pin, here's where a justice conversation is happening around this. There's not a lot of people talking about emotions and climate change in terms of justice. So it's really quite an undiscussed trilogy of concepts. The climate and emotions discussion is really robust, and the climate and justice conversation is really robust, but the overlap of both of those, or the meeting of both those worlds, is just beginning to happen. And I really hope, and I put in a link into the chat for everybody. There's a free virtual symposium that Jade Sasser, Blanche Verley, and I are co-organizing. It will be at Riverside. Shamta mentioned that. But one day is in person and one day is online. So if you wanted to join the online portion, which is the majority of the talks actually on the second day, April 28th, if you're available April 28th and you're interested, the program isn't quite up yet, but it's free and you can register and get the link to it and participate. And, you know, we've been trying, the three of us have gotten together over the past couple of years to think about this nexus of these three things: climate, justice, emotions, and what's happening and why there isn't more research in that nexus. So this is our first attempt at bringing everyone together to try to talk about those three things if you're interested in joining. So please check it out. And without further ado, I'll get started talking with my slideshow. And I'm excited too to hear about, to go to the part of the session that's the community dialogue. So that's really exciting too. So here we go, slides coming. Okay, so this is of course the topic. This is just the opening slide. That's not very special, but I do want to just comment for a moment. I'm not quite sure I love this title anymore about saving the planet. I have been recently enjoying and loving to read, speaking of Shamta's light acknowledgement, Vanessa Andreotti's beautiful book, Hospicing Modernity. And that book would have me writing a different title right now. So we can talk about that in Q&A if you want. To get us started, why even talk about this question of emotions in the efforts and the projects and all the different movements around thinking about climate change, and the maybe even broadening out to what is now being called this polycrisis? Around 2014, 2013, I really started to notice something really different changing in my students. Prior to that, they were studying environmental problems, and yeah, it was not positive information, but they kind of signed up for it. You know, they'd walk in class, they knew they were wanting to face the realities of what was happening in the world. And the content of the classes wasn't inherently despairing or making them feel like there was no point in even showing up anymore. Something changed around 2014, where my students were becoming overwhelmed, burned out, despairing, apathetic, all kinds of things, nihilistic even, around information they were learning from outside the classrooms and also sometimes inside their classrooms around climate. And so I started to kind of collect, take notes of what my students were feeling, because I didn't have the tools myself to figure out what to do with these students. And I had been trained in a model of environmental studies where the point of your teaching was to get students to care. And you do that by scaring them, what I call the scare to care model. And this may be similar to some of the classes you're currently taking, but I've since watching what's happening to my students and then also researching this question, is this an effective model, scare to care? Is this a good idea? Is this going to turn our students into the climate warriors that we want them to be, that we're promising in all of our brochures? And it turns out the research on this is pretty mixed and maybe would say no. So where did this all start? And what do students in this particular moment need instead, if that's no longer the model that really works anymore? So one of the ways that my students were coming to the classroom feeling, or getting out of my classes even, I should admit that they were probably getting this partly from me, is that there is no good that they can do for the planet, only impact. So every action they took was framed in this concept of impact. They would have the ecological footprint exercise right in their minds. Every time they'd go to the store, they'd have this existential crisis about consumption. Everything that they did had a footprint, and there was anything good they could do. And they weren't hearing any stories about humanity being very good. So there was no options or no stories, no examples, no models of how it is that there's anything positive that any human could do. And everything that they were learning in their classes were very much framed in humans versus nature, right? Humans were doing all this stuff to nature. And I have to say, like, even my kids, 9 and 12-year-olds, come home and will say people are the problem or humanity is the problem. And I think, oh, what have I done with even my own kids? So this is a message they're getting in lots of different places. Karen Litvin calls this the misanthropic temptation, by the way. They feel alone and crazy in the intensity of their feelings. And so one of the things that was really a revelation to me was how common these feelings were, but students weren't actually sharing them with each other. They're often not sharing them with their families or parents. They're often not even bringing them up in places where you think that they might bring it up, like in mental health settings, where there's so much shame and stigma attached to something called climate emotions, right? That I would have intense feelings of nihilism and despair and even depression because of my fears about what's happening to the planet. That language around that is only very recently started to become normalized in mental health settings. They felt that the problems are too big and interconnected and that there's a little that we can do to fix them. So this is, I put this on a bullet point list, but I'd say this is the big one, right? This is the one where people start to feel powerless. And once you have powerlessness, then you have the slippery slope towards all kinds of terrible things, not to mention people becoming unable to do the work required to protect the environment or do any kind of activism or advocacy for climate. But it even goes off the cliff of things like suicide and suicidal ideation and all kinds of forms of feelings of worthlessness. And in fact, one definition of depression is a feeling of not having any control over the conditions of your life. And so I think this particular problem of the way that climate change as framed as a problem is particularly pernicious. And that's where I spend most of my energy in my talk today, thinking about how do we fix that particular one. So with some simple reframings of the problem and just some information about how this is simply not true. They feel that we are past the point of no return. So this is a generation that was, I think, maybe 16 years old when the last IPCC report told us that we only have 12 years left. So this is a generation that is coming of age in a moment of a serious timeline that feels existential. They feel that it's easier. This is actually a quote from Kari Norgaard, who's a sociologist who did a study of this. And most young people feel similar to most Americans that it's easier to imagine apocalypse than a post-fossil fuel society. And of course, this is when you dig into the psychological reasons for this, one of the explanations is something called the availability bias, which basically is we'll believe what's going to happen in the future is whatever we can most easily recall from our minds. And it seems so simple and obvious, but it's evidence that we're not rational, right? What is most likely to happen in the future is based on something else. It's not whatever Hollywood movie we just saw, right? So this is an example. I'm starting to lay some breadcrumbs to get to the point that, hey, emotions actually matter more than reason around how it is that we make decisions and change behavior around climate. Availability bias is not a rational thing, but the vast majority of Americans believe apocalypse is more likely than something else. They feel that their life course is unclear and that it won't be like previous generations. And they even feel, and a recent study proved this, and there's also a new Canadian, you can access this in Canada, the Climate Baby Dilemma, a new Canadian public television show that's just come out, a movie actually, it's about a 40-minute long movie about the climate baby dilemma. About 1 in 4 young people ages 16 to 25 don't want to have children because the planet will be uninhabitable for the next generation. Now, that's a very different argument for not having children than the 60s and 70s environmentalists when they refuse to reproduce. And we can talk about that in Q&A if you want to, what the distinctions are there. They have this sense of nihilism. They can barely show up to class, much less save the planet or do any of the things that we hope that they're going to do as their teachers. They have emotions of fatalism, apathy, overwhelm, empathic distress, and numbing. And so I don't know if any of these, you can check your own box, how are you presenting, or how many of these feel like you? Some of them may not be. In fact, many of them may not be. I don't want to make a presumption. I certainly don't want to paint all of you with the same assumption. That's something that also came out in my teaching, is that it's quite dangerous to assume that all students feel this way, right? But what I'm painting a picture of here is that something was happening in my classes over a few years that made me rethink what I was doing in the classroom and what it is that this generation was going to need from their education. And they feel, of course, resentment, betrayal, and anger for the selfishness, denial, and delay of previous generations. And so the sense of you're handing us over the 6-year or 12-year long problem, we only have this amount of time to fix it, And, there's a lot of resentment there. We don't, young people will say, I don't want this problem. I don't want to have this sense of purpose. I'd rather just make fun videos on TikTok and not worry about this thing or whatever, that privileges of previous generation and their comfort. So this is how my students felt. I had a sense of my own existential crisis when I realized that I couldn't fix all these problems for my students. It made the set of concerns that the classroom was normally set to cover much more expanded beyond just content, and more about process and more about community and more about things that other areas of education might teach you, like social movements or psychology or contemplative practices. There's all kinds of other spaces where dealing with this set of concerns is where people have expertise around that. Wisdom traditions, spirituality, and environmental educators like myself had no training in this. And so since I wrote this book, I started thinking about this book, Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, in about 2015 to respond to this. And then all my energy has shifted towards thinking about how do we reinvent the interfaces that we have, especially with young people, but for all of us, a lot of people are interested in these questions, not just young people. However, there's really great data on there that this is generationally different if you want to look that up. So what am I going to talk about today, now that I've set this sort of table about why does this matter? First, I want to talk about why emotions are key to climate justice work and education and activism, and not just reason and logic and technology and that kind of thing. I want to give an overview of the inner practices I describe in a field guide to climate anxiety, and I'm happy to have that conversation. I'm not going to talk about it today, but if it's in Q&A, great. Is inner practices just wasting our time? Is it just lifestyle and sustainable lifestyle stuff that doesn't really change systems? All of those questions I obviously have a lot of thoughts about and happy to talk about if people are interested. I'm going to do a little deep dive into one of those practices. And while I'm in that deep dive, I'm going to do a little segue into how the emotion, I'm really interested in my book and thinking about the role of different types of emotions and whether they're useful for climate action. And that makes it sound like simple, as if there are some emotions that are useful for climate action, and actually it's much more complicated than that. But I want to explore a little bit about how an example of the emotion of fear can sabotage climate policy. And of course, it's good for climate action too. So I mean, I'll caveat that, right? All these emotions can go all the ways. So some questions that I want to leave you with, and I think are going to be the structure of the open community dialogue after my talk, about how we might cultivate a climate mind, what I also call the existential toolkit. Just some questions, some generative questions to get us sort of talking, thinking, reflecting on it, and then Q&A and discussion, and then we're going to move on to the community dialogue. So this is sort of the terrain I'm hoping to explore and journey through today with you all. So why do emotions matter? First, and I think this is becoming kind of dominant mainstream knowledge, but it's not the way I was raised, and it's against so much of the stuff I see in my daily life. This assumption that reason, logic, facts, science, that those things are somehow holding all of the wisdom, and that we should follow all that stuff in order to make the best decisions. And in fact, what researchers show is that that's not true. That's not how humans make decisions. That's not how students retain knowledge. That's not how communities are built. That's not how we come up with determining what the most responsible actions are in our lives, much less how we engage in long time, passions and works and fulfilling careers and vocations over the long term, despite lots of setbacks. So one of the things that's really challenging, I find with my students, is that they see so much evidence that the work for climate justice is not panning out. So these setbacks, how do we manage and continue to do that work? This is stuff that's based on heart stuff and not just head stuff, despite our most prominent assumptions is otherwise. The science of emotions shows that different emotions shape action in different ways. And when I say we should try to be strategic about that, I'm also sort of hedging on that, right? Like, you can't control or police emotions, right? However, when I'm teaching a class, I can pretty guarantee that if I teach one particular thing, that 75% of my students will be depressed, versus if I teach it a different way, they might feel empowered, right? So it might not be all the students, it's not going to land always the same way, but we might want to think about empowerment as a more ideal emotion to leave students with, or leave people with, leave our Uncle Bob over fall break, or whatever it is that we're, the people that we're engaging with. Their emotional state matters a lot to whether or not they're going to care about or act on anything that we're talking about. So using that information about different emotions and how they generate and attenuate action strategically is to the extent that that's even possible. Other people, like in the fields of psychology, contemplative practice, mindfulness, anybody who studies and works with grief or anger knows that the suppression of these uncomfortable emotions, which is really prominent in mainstream Western society, this kind of stigmatizing of negative emotions, so-called, actually just fuels the problem more. So when we say, oh no, we shouldn't have those bad feelings, we're crazy for having those bad feelings, we have whatever stigma attached to it, and we suppress them, it often makes us do more things and act in ways that further contribute to the fraying of relationships between each other and certainly with the more than human world. So someone like Joanna Macy would say, you got to turn towards your grief. Or Robin Wall Kimmerer's beautiful comments on grief, where she says, you turn towards it because in that grief, we find what we love. And then that's from which the energy is generated to do what's needed to protect that, what we love, right? So there's a lot of conversation happening around the role of so-called negative emotions in climate work. And then finally, and this is a really simple kind of feedback loop I'll talk about a little bit later, but our mental and physical health affects our ability to engage in climate justice. Most people talk about climate change's effects on mental and physical health. That's what the vast majority of research in the public sphere is all about. But what I'm trying to argue here is that's all the more reason to say that, in fact, our inner lives affect our ability to engage in climate justice. If we think about the much energy that we have in the world, we think about protecting our physical and mental health as a resource that is the juice behind the climate movement, that might make us think differently about how we relate to the kind of overwork and burnout mentality of most climate advocacy. And we often think about burnout happening in like the corporate sphere, but actually among activists and climate folks, it's even worse, because there's a sense of the urgency and the privilege creating this sort of cocktail of guilt and fear and amygdala hijack that makes people kind of burn and run on empty much more intensely. Okay, so what does this mean for the climate generation? This is all sort of like emotions matter. So what does this mean for us? This is what I try to answer in A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, my book, kind of main tools, kind of categorized in 5 categories. It's more like 8 or 9 chapters in there, but I tried to condense it here, right? So related to the things we just saw. First, getting comfortable with unpleasant emotions. Instead of fetishizing happiness and pathologizing mental health as something that you do in private or that gets in the way of productive work, we ought to be thinking about uncomfortable emotions as a map for action, the juice of our resilience. It shows us what we love, and the love for that thing or for those things or that community or whatever is the thing that actually generates much more long-term stamina for work. We are pleasure-seeking machines. Our brains are designed that way. And so when something feels good, we keep coming back for more. Adrienne Maree Brown beautifully puts it that we ought to make justice the most pleasurable experience possible. It's just sort of adding this pleasure frame into what it is that this work, the sort of strategy of this movement. Second, rejecting the myth of the individual. This is something that lots of indigenous scholars and people from many wisdom traditions and philosophical bents would argue the sort of dominant accepted explanation for why we've gotten into this problem in the first place, if you go the farthest upstream as you possibly can, comes down to this disconnection between ourselves and the more than human world that was precipitated by Cartesian thought, by initially, of course, by colonization and the age of expansion, age of science and age of reason, and then made even worse by industrial capitalism. So we often think of capitalism as the origin, but if you look at folks like Kyle Powys White and other folks will say, no, the first sort of white supremacist notion that people should overcome nature, that nature was mechanistic, it was in our way, was the beginning of an unraveling of all these relationships. And so this myth of the individual comes up everywhere we turn. When we think about our powerlessness, even, it is the myth of the individual that tells us that we have no power, right? So we can't, on the one hand, be feeling terribly guilty about how we're impacting the environment, and on the other hand, think we have no power to fix the problem, right? There's an inherent contradiction there. So once we start to reject the myth of the individual, all kinds of things open up. 3, hack the story. Instead of a doom and gloom narrative, the planet actually needs us to live in stories of people hospicing the destructive systems and building better ones. And again, this goes to Vanessa Andreotti's work, where she talks about hospicing modernity. When I think about hacking the story, I think, oh, we need to live in a story where the great turning is happening. I'm going to talk about Joanna Macy's concept of the great turning in a moment. But actually, it involves this other work too that Vanessa Andreotti describes really beautifully about hospicing modernity, hospicing the destructive systems. That work needs to be done too. How is it that I, as a white privileged professor from North America, carry around, do the work of unconsciously or consciously, am invested in and benefit from all these ways that modernity is destructive? So hospicing requires that examination and that interrogation of all the ways that is happening through me. So the hospicing plus the building, not just the building. 4, engaging in radical self-care for the planet. This is also counterintuitive for most climate activists who feel that there's no time for this, right? But to go to this point I mentioned on the last point on the last slide, that chronic and acute stress diminish our mental and physical capacity to engage. It seems pretty obvious. But how do we build our personal window of tolerance, as Dan Siegel calls it? Psychologist and neuroscientist Dan Siegel talks about this window of tolerance. I'll bring it up a little bit. I have an image for it. If we build our window of tolerance, we're much more capable of acting out of compassion, acting out of equanimity, acting for, in fact, a larger vision of what we're hoping for, rather than just kind of putting out fires and reacting based on what the most immediate threat is in front of us. And then 5, feeding what you want to grow. Neuroscience and spiritual traditions alike know that wherever your mind goes, your energy flows. And so this really is drawing on, again, Adrienne Maree Brown's work, where she talks about the kind of garden of your mind. If you are putting fertilizer, sunlight, rain onto one side of the garden and not on the other, that garden will grow. So if we spend all of our time doom scrolling, we spend all of our time on all the terrible news that's in the world, those things actually get bigger, not just in our perception, but in fact in material reality as well. And that's a larger conversation I won't unpack right now. But whatever we feed will grow. Whatever we feed with our attention becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's kind of the arc of the book, is sort of the existential toolkit. I want to hone in a little bit on this one here, on Hack the Story, by way of Joanna Macy's work. So why does the story that we live in matter? And we're all living in stories. Everything is framed. Everything is composed around what is included and not excluded, what's prioritized. Even scientific reports are stories, right? Our syllabi is a story. Every time we consume and then share something on social media, we are producing stories, we're perpetuating stories. I use this example of the Pacific Islanders protesting that they are not drowning, they are fighting. This was in response to the previous COP conference, where there was a discussion over this question of, can we survive 1.5 degrees increase in the planet's temperature? And there was a sort of inevitable acceptance that that was going to happen. And the justice movements of these types of folks and a transnational indigenous and environmental justice movement was saying, hey, no, this sort of like story of inevitable genocide is not something that we're accepting, right? So we're going to live in a different story, perpetuate a different story. We can see that beautifully here in this, just this, spray painted banner. So what's the story about the great unraveling? Joanna Macy talks about stories, and as I'm trying to talk about, is so critically important for what it is that we're doing. It creates an energy field of our action, right? And so Joanna Macy famously in her work that reconnects talks about the 3 stories of now. And one of them, the one story kind of on one end of the spectrum is the story of the great unraveling. And in this story, it draws attention to the disasters caused by industrial growth society. It's a story of ongoing derangement and collapse of all of these systems. It's the sixth great extinction story. It's the hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, and wildfires, like almost getting biblical here. Whole ecosystems are being destroyed, military operations and conflicts, famine, drought, driving refugees, more racism, more enmities flaring up, taking an immeasurable toll on human suffering. And so this is the story of the great unraveling that I don't know if you, as you're listening to that and reading that, if you feel like that's the story that we live in, like that's just truth, right? That's just reality. That is the vast majority of what we see from folks like David Wallace Wells, The Uninhabitable Earth. This is a story that's been coming around with climate alarmism since the 70s. And this is not, it's not that the story isn't true. That's not what I'm suggesting, or that this is sort of fake news. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. But the effect of this story is critical to examine. So let's unpack, what is the effect of living in this story on you? If your heart raised and you kind of wanted to shut down and leave this talk because of what I was just reading, you know what I'm talking about, right? It has this effect of overwhelm, right? And the interconnection. I have some slides here that are trying to say all the polycrisis of all of these things. We've got, the prison industrial complex is worsened by California fires, and so they fuel each other. We got climate refugees and the problems of authoritarianism and white supremacy getting heightened because of climate change. All of these different systems of oppression and destruction kind of reinforcing each other with climate change, and climate change being the kind of compounder of all of these problems. This is what comes up in the news. This is what we see. This is a dominant story, of course, that we're living in. So let's deconstruct the key elements of the story. First, it has a trope of inevitability, that you can do nothing to stop it, or as we hear from a lot of people who are in the kind of denialist camps, that this is just natural. There's this element of decline from an era of good times. If you want to use a sort of like biblical framework on it, we talk about the sort of fall from grace or banishment from a garden of good times. The concept of sort of making America great again, of course, comes out of this. It used to be great and we've declined, right? This sort of decline from a good time. You can see in the background, I'm using the warming stripes of temperature change since 1715 to 1890 or something. I can't remember exactly the years on this one. Apologies, I don't remember the years. But the story of decline is implicit even in the artwork that's behind these words in front of you. So there's also a scale assumed in this story, the scale of global and larger than any human can handle, right? And so this largeness of the problem being, that no single human being can even affect or touch, it's overwhelming. And this is why Timothy Morton calls climate change a hyper object. And if you're interested in looking that up, I recommend it. It's super interesting. I won't get into it today. And there's unspecific actors that are the culprit, right? Humanity is the villain here, right? There's no specific person or corporation or, government that can be held accountable. And so that makes it very different than other crises that humans have felt in other different settings. There's a pessimistic view of human nature, that humans are bad or selfish or greedy, and that's perpetuated, of course, by a vast majority of climate discourse. There's no evidence of progress or pathways for solutions. There's no helpers around. This particular, element is slowly being corrected by things like the Solutions Journalism Network, and people are trying to counterbalance that. But the overwhelming interest of the vast majority of media is very powerfully in favor of not including solutions, right? If it bleeds, it leads. Negativity bias in vast majority of audiences means that they get more dollars and eyeballs for the worse the news is that they present. So this can create, as you see where I'm going with this, a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So the intended emotional effects, of course, are fear, anxiety, resignation, powerlessness, apathy, separation from each other, separation from the more than human world, just keep diving into numbing, right? And urgency. So there's all kinds of ways that this manifests, none of which are particularly inherently good for the planet, although a little bit of it to get us motivated. As some people argue, a little bit of fear, a little bit of guilt, a little bit of these anxiety can be really productive, right? We've seen a lot of really cool research on the positives of things like anxiety, for example. So, but what does the story of the great unraveling do to our capacity to respond? And here I'm going to kind of give you the little graphic of what the window of tolerance looks like. And this is kind of like neuroscience. When you are faced with a stimulus that's really scary, your amygdala gets hijacked, your prefrontal cortex goes offline, you're typically triggered outside of the window of tolerance into either hyper or hypoarousal. And in hyperarousal, you may have experiences of fight or flight, overwhelm, hypervigilance, anxiety. So this is kind of like one side of the trauma experience. And then the hypoarousal is sort of like the shutdown, the numbing, the withdrawing, the freezing part of what happens when we're faced with a threat. Ideally, when we're in this window of tolerance space, we're able to be grounded and flexible and curious and compassionate and self-regulated and do the wisest things in our days, right? And for people who've experienced a lot of trauma in their life or ACEs in their life, that window of tolerance tends to be narrower, and the work of trauma therapy is often to broaden that window of tolerance. And of course, when we think about something like climate or a collective trauma, that window of tolerance gets shrunken too if we're not aware of it and if we don't take action to keep that built, right? And so that's really the premise of what I'm trying to offer here, is that when we have a narrow window of tolerance, we're not actually doing good things for the climate. What else does it do to our capacity to respond? It has the effect, and this goes to the point I was making earlier about how powerlessness is the worst thing, right? Of all the ways that my students presented, powerlessness is the one I'm the most afraid of. Well, I started to research this further and realized that there is a term to describe what my students were going through called pseudo-inefficacy. And pseudo, of course, means kind of like fake or not real, and inefficacy means inability to have power, right? Like no agency. So it's like this perception of one's powerlessness, meaning it's not actual powerlessness, it's perceived powerlessness. And here the definition is that the idea that people are less likely to offer help if they think that the problem is too big for them to solve. The positive feeling of solving any small part of a problem is outweighed by the negative feeling of not solving the whole. And so I see students all the time in this boat, right? I'm just a drop in the bucket. If I don't use this straw, it's not going to matter. What's the point of anything, right? And so this leads us to a complete state of apathy and nihilism that I really am concerned about. So pseudo-inefficacy hints at the fact that this is just a perception, right? This isn't actually a reality. And we can get to that in a minute. So how does this all happen? Negativity bias, I just mentioned, an increased perception of risks all around. We're living in a scary, awful world. The great turning story comes out of that, right? We obviously gather all this data from the news or doom scrolling or from our own lives. Now we're living in a story of the great unraveling. This is actually a mindset that creates pseudo-efficacy, psychic numbing, empathic distress, which, as you can imagine, leads to typically, oftentimes, there are times when this is not always true, of course, but inaction, apathy, and fear. And this, of course, leads to the crisis worsening. So this isn't always the case, but this is what I was noticing in my students and started to cause me some concern. Again, this is my little digression into fear. Let's go there. What's up with this fear? Why is this so dangerous? Well, fear, which is a very useful, natural human response to a stimulus that's threatening, so I want to caveat that, can also lead to two harmful outcomes if we don't, again, dive into it, face it, become mindful of it, and work with it. If we try to suppress it, ignore it, often can lead to some harmful outcomes. Well, the first of the harmful outcomes, as we just saw, are like my students, and I'm sorry I had this person Florsheim in here. I had a quote from a student that I just took out, or just a minute ago, and I didn't update that there. But this sense of like, the world is so bad, I'm just going to turn inward and do less and less and less, and I'm going to be in hypoarousal, numb out zone, which actually just makes the problem even worse, right? It makes the structural systems actually become more like what we are fearing. But what I want to pay attention to go to Shamta's point earlier, is a perhaps more pernicious unraveling if you add climate anxiety and climate fear into an already existing landscape of white supremacy. What you have is this bolstering of what's actually been a long tradition of ecofascism and what Betsy Hartman calls green hate. And green hate is defined as sort of basically when violence towards communities that are deemed threats to natural resources gets justified as environmental protection. So we do violence towards a particular group of people because we think they're the cause of the problem, when in fact they're probably the victims of the problem, right? And it ends up becoming a really good kind of like green justification for various forms of xenophobia, nativism, etc. Right? So let's see some examples of this. We have the roots of green hate in America, and I'm guessing Canada has some similar stuff. The beginnings of this are really actually manifest destiny. We think about the notion that certain types of people, the way that they interacted with the land was not good for the resource, and so therefore they deserved to be eradicated, right? So that the particular notions of what it meant to be good for the environment created these forms of human violence. Manifest destiny notions led to concepts of the close of the American frontier, which then created a social engineering crisis on the heels of Darwin's work and scientific racism that then lent itself to eugenics. And people don't think of eugenics and environmental stuff in the same soup usually, but in fact, and this is the topic of my first book, The Ecological Other, these two things were very intertwined. Eugenics was very much an environmental response. The people who were promoting eugenics were actually the grandfathers of ecology in the United States. And who took up those ideas the most powerfully, of course, was Adolf Hitler in Germany and in Europe. Used the concept of elbow room or Lebensraum, this notion of diminishing or threatened space, like the end of the frontier, as a threat to white supremacy, as a threat to a nation identity. And so the ideas of resources and natural landscapes and blood and soil ideology is very much rooted in early environmental ideas. We see this in the population bomb, and we see this, and I'm doing this quick historical sketch just because Shamta mentioned it, and I really wanted to make sure, yeah, why do these emotions matter for justice, right? The greenwashing of the far right is manifesting, as we see in many forms of violence we've seen of late. We can see this just, for example, in Buffalo, and the mass shootings that happen in Buffalo, the mass shootings that happen in El Paso, in Christchurch, where there's a climate anxiety kind of fuels this white extinction anxiety, which psychologists call emotional diversion. You're seeing a threat and you divert the cause of the problem onto a particular group. And this, of course, informs what has been called the Great Replacement theory. So that's just to sort of, draw a line in the sand of that. Fear can have this alternative life, right? It can be very productive and helpful. It can generate a lot of action, but not all action in response to big emotions is good action, right? So to maintain ourselves in a window of tolerance, to make sure that in our response to threats, we are doing things that are in support of and service of regeneration of life, of community. Those are really the critical questions that I want to be bringing up here around what big emotions around the environment can be very, very, very productive and wonderful, but they can also be destructive. And we have to make sure we're doing the work necessary to make sure that doesn't happen at the political level. Joanna Macy talks about an alternative story, the Great Turning. She talks about a story that we are transitioning from an industrial growth society to a life-sustaining one, attitude shift. More and more people come to see that they're interwoven. We recognize solidarity. There's a real focus here on interconnection, as you see, and we work towards for the sake of the earth. So this raises the question about these stories that we live in, right? We're in this point of the talk where I'm talking about these stories, right? Who benefits from us believing the great unraveling, right? So just sort of a question to posit in the air there. Who is most threatened by the Great Turning? Right? Who is most threatened by thinking that we are in fact in a womb, not a tomb, as Valerie Carr beautifully put it in 2016. So some people are thinking about the Great Turning. Oftentimes it's artists, oftentimes it's people from margins, it's oftentimes the people who have not benefited the most from the existing systems who embrace change. And I love this mural. Basically, we won't, this happened during COVID. COVID was this opportunity to rethink existing systems and maybe ditch some of them. Basically said we shouldn't go back to normal. Normal wasn't good. So this is a rejection of that decline narrative, remember? So the pre-corona existence was not good or normal, other than we normalize these awful things, extraction, inequity. We shouldn't long to return to that. We are being given an opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. And so this sort of like, this is not decline, this is not crisis, this is opportunity, this is the new world we want to build. What do we want instead? We don't want to just imagine apocalypse, we want to imagine this future society that we would desire, rather than be attached to the things that are going to be hospiced in this process, right? So what are the key elements of this Great Turning story? The future is ours to make. We have power to do that. Better worlds are possible if we can let go of the old ones. A movement of helpers exists. So this is the critique of the individual myth. Awareness of the collective and the ancestor perspective diminishes individualism and alienation. Specific people and systems are to blame. It's not all of humanity. There's, in fact, something like 5% of the global population is indigenous, and they have 80% of the world's biodiversity, which suggests this is not inherently a problem of humans, right? There is just as much evidence that humans do good things as bad. And examples of the Great Turning, of course, are not going to make the news, because this is not what the eyeballs give people money for when you're in the business of news. And then, of course, the intended emotional effects: hope, empowerment, solidarity, efficacy, pleasure, joy, right? This is the story of building the world we desire. All right, so what does this mean for us? We think about climate disruption in the middle here, kicking off this feedback loop of stress, right? So on the left, the reactivity one is we're kicked out of our window of tolerance. That creates as reactivity instead of wise action, which increases structural stress, which decreases the ability of our systems that we live in to mitigate climate change, which of course create the self-fulfilling prophecy of making climate disruption even worse. What we're hoping for here is in the Great Turning, this resilience model, right? That this actually kicks off an opportunity to stitch the new garment, right? We now are decreasing structural stress, which actually increases our ability to mitigate climate change. The way I see this in sort of simplified ways is like a feedback loop. Yeah, climate change affects mental health, but mental health also affects climate change. And so to disrupt the ways that mental health affects climate, the climate change affects mental health is in itself a form of activism for the planet. Who else says that this is true? Well, we think about Donella Meadows' concept of leverage points. Christine Wamsler and a bunch of people are talking about inner capacities like emotional intelligence, mindsets, values as the most critical leverage point for addressing the polycrisis, even more so than systems changes or giving economic incentives for different types of corporate behavior. Even more than that, the higher impact is the changing mental models. It's going further upstream than those things. And so this leaves me with this question for you. If you're convinced, if I've convinced you that your emotions matter, your emotional life, your inner life matters, that your inner life is powerful, that you matter, that you're powerful, here are some open questions to start to think about building your existential toolkit. And I'm going to move towards concluding here. Consider the ancestor principle. This is something I'm drawing from Olufemi Taiwo's work from his beautiful book, Reconsidering Reparations. The practice of imagining and desiring your future is vital. Don't be brainwashed by the availability and negativity biases that tell you that the world's terrible and that the future is going to be just as bad as what you just saw on the last apocalyptic movie. Think about Taiwo's concept of the ancestor principle. Greta Thunberg calls this cathedral thinking, right? We're not operating in isolation. We're not operating in isolation in our lifetimes on this planet, and we certainly are not acting in isolation across generations. If you see yourself in this chorus of people across history and around the world who try to make things better, how might that shift things for you? So this is seeing yourself as part of the Great Turning. A second open question. Stop letting harmful systems work through you. How are you personally invested in the status quo? In what ways do you, quote, donate your energy, body, actions, and thoughts in service of destructive systems? And I'm using the word donate in quotes because this is Tricia Hersey's work from her beautiful book, Rest is Resistance. How do you amplify the story of the great unraveling? Who does the perception of powerlessness and fatalism serve? If you feel powerless, who's served by that? In what ways do you distance yourself from the problems, diminish their significance, or disavow your role in them? And everybody, as Vanessa Andreotti says, everybody is part of this system. Feed what you want to grow. To what do you donate your attention? Do you doom scroll, thinking that it's your duty to be informed? If your attention makes money for media corporations, how might it be harnessed in service of what you love instead? What can you do to counterbalance the negativity bias of your brain and the news? How might you turn your attention toward that which you want to see grow? What could you do with your time and energy that would be useful no matter what the future holds, right? So instead of thinking, is it futile? Is it worthwhile? Whatever the future holds, something is going to be productive, right? All right, so think about relationships instead of righteousness. This is really counter to dominant culture. Community trust, even across political and cultural divides, is more predictive of climate resilience than good infrastructure or other band-aids on symptoms. What can you do in your life to shift your energy from pursuing your own success or power over or climb up the hierarchy or be on the hedonic treadmill for cultivating community and relationships, power with? What would it take to be less right and more in relation? Cultivate climate wisdom. For this is about doing the work on yourself that's needed to learn how emotions and actions are conditioned by the culture you live in. You're swimming in this fishbowl, right? What's the water you're swimming in? What triggers you out of your resilience zone? Can you practice noticing the way that emotions like fear and powerless, but also joy and love, work on you? And then learn ways to expand your resilience zone. And this, so the pro moves is like where I'm trying to go. I mean, I'm still working on all these things, but like this is other stuff I love too. Embracing ambiguity. You know, we live in a pro-binary world, most prominently advocated for by Cartesian thought back from the Enlightenment era. How about uncertainty, paradox, impermanence? Yeah, and how about mortality, right? Can we face mortality as a practice? Resisting urgency, crisis thinking, or what Kyle Passway calls crisis epistemology, is a recipe for fear, fatalism, burnout, and worse, right? That's the stuff I was just talking about with the white extinction anxiety and great replacement theory. When we perceive ourselves to be time scarce, we care less about others. There's all kinds of research to support this. So whatever is telling you that you're time scarce, that you don't have enough time, question it, stop, pause for a moment. What's that about? Read Tricia Hersey's Rest is Resistance, read about the Good Samaritan experiment. There's all kinds of really cool research on the perception of time scarcity. It's not actual time scarcity, right? So how can we feel more abundant in time? Because that will create the conditions for us to build the relationships, which is the top point, of course. When we perceive ourselves to be we care less about others, how do you avoid what's happening in the world? How can you slow down as a way of caring and connecting, right? So that's available to us. Those are the questions for us. And I know we're going to come back to those in our discussion. Leaving you with Paul Hawken and a few favorite of my quotes, and then I'll be done. The most complex radical climate technology on Earth is the human heart and mind, not a solar panel. I love that. What if we invested in hearts and minds the way we invest in solar panels and green technology? Technology is not the most radical climate technology. Adrienne Ray Brown's work, I mentioned this earlier, we have to make justice the most pleasurable experience humans can have. What would that look like for you? And of course, this is Bayako Malafe's work. The times are urgent. We must slow down. This paradox, again, containing paradox. Speaking of containing paradox, I want to show you another example. You could do this as a workshop with your fellow students. You can do this in your classes, but you check out ventdiagrams.com, which is something I learned about in the book Beyond Survival, that has all these examples of containing paradox, dealing with ambiguity. Is both and all the time. It's too late, it's not too late, right? Climate change changes everything and it's terrifying. It's also about time for it to change everything, right? We're in the womb, not the tomb. We are all complicit. Oh, but it's actually structural, right? So all of these kind of both and worlds, I find personally very helpful for me as I navigate climate change. So I'm going to stop there, stop the share, and thank you so much for your attention. I hope that there's some Q&A and discussion or whatever's next. I'll leave Shanta up to direct to where we're going next. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was absolutely, I took so many notes that I'm going to be looking into after this. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. We really appreciate that. We do have some questions. I'm going to start with my own because I'm just like really wanting to hear your thoughts on this. And you kind of touched on it. You talked about emotions matter more than reason. And so I wanted to kind of pick your brains on that. So I've been working on and doing some research on kindness-informed pedagogies in my own teaching related to climate and sustainability learning, where we can operationalize our compassion and normalize emotions like you talk about to really cultivate that learning community. And you center emotions through your own professional development workshops work that you do through the Climate Wisdom Lab. I actually participated in one of them and I learned a lot, and I use some of your activities in my own teaching. So thank you for that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of cultivating emotional being in the climate crisis movement, and how do we help students develop that climate wisdom in the classroom as teachers and facilitators? Or how might students do this for themselves and support each other, and in both in their classrooms, but also in student groups and activist communities, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that's just a huge question. And I feel like you probably have a lot to offer here yourself. I don't know if I can add to your thinking. I'll try though. So you said emotional being, right? And I'm immediately thinking, oh, as opposed to doing. So in a lot of, Thich Nhat Hanh and kind of mindfulness circles, we talk about we're not human doings, we're human beings, right? And so I'm immediately globbing onto that aspect of what you said, although I don't think that was what you were really referring to. So how do we promote being instead of doing in the classroom? Is how I'm interpreting your question. And so the slowing down part is critical. Students, most of my classes that I've ever taught have a similar attitude as the productivist imaginary of capitalist treadmill stuff, right? So I am trying to teach students to read faster, read more, be more detailed, produce more, be really productive, manage their time better, basically turn into better capitalists, right? And so when I realized that that was an implicit mindset underneath my approach to teaching, I started to think, well, what would it look like to not do that in my teaching? What would it look to build in more being and prioritize doing less? And that can look like lots of different things. I think there's many different things that can look like. And in that space that's created from the doing and not from the being and not the doing, I think that there is an actual thing that happens. It's not that people then check out and they're no longer effective at doing the work. On the contrary, what ends up happening is that they're more equipped to filter out the stuff that matters most and prioritize that. So there's in the space of reflection and the space of that open up in the being, not the doing. That's where all the work happens, where you can figure out where you're going to put your energy to, what really matters to you, what you really value. And I could go on sort of along like what happens in that space. There's probably 10 more things that could happen in that space. But to your point about, kindness, pedagogy, a significant amount of what we can do in the classroom and students could do is figure out how it is that their activism, that the way that they are being in the world, the way they think, the ideas they have, what they think of as positive and negative action are actually being informed by untrustworthy sources, right? So the water we're swimming in metaphor, right? We're swimming around in culture, and some of us have a pretty good grasp on how it works on us because maybe we come from cultures or families that have been really, really non-dominant, right? So we might have a better sense of how to be outside of this fishbowl. But for people like myself, who was raised in the deep depth of that exact Western Cartesian, colonial, capitalist, individualistic, binary thinking fishbowl, the work of figuring out how I am actually doing the work for those systems by not being critical of those things, the work of examining how those cultural filters have been built up over the course of my life, the work of recognizing how that culture works through me and I'm not conscious of it, that's a lot of work, right? That could take a lifetime of reflection and examination. And I think that's really worthwhile doing. That's really what Vanessa Andreotti's work is all about. Her entire website, gesturing, this is a collective she's part of called Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, and I'll just throw it into the chat real quick. That's all of her work. I'm bringing all that stuff into my classes next time I teach, because now I've just discovered this stuff, so I'm all hopped up on it. And so there's the examination of how we are ourselves not doing our own thinking and acting, right? And how those things could be reproducing the harmful systems that I theoretically don't like. And so, yeah, the being part over the doing part is an example of that. And yeah, there's a lot of the compassion part that you said, operationalizing compassion. This is critical. We feel so harmed. We feel so victimized. We have politics of outrage. I mean, all of the stuff that people are writing books right, left, and center about how we live in a world of polarization and culture wars and all this. Compassion is the antidote. And so, which isn't to say that we should approve of or agree with or condone people who do harmful things. That's not the same as compassion. But compassion takes so much of the edge off of anger, puts us back into the window of tolerance so that we can deal with those sources of harm, those structures of harm, from a place of equanimity and wisdom. Otherwise, we're just, flailing around in a state of dysregulation, and all of our energy is not going anywhere necessarily useful, to deal with the structures that we don't like, right? So, yeah, and I think window of tolerance, regulation, dysregulation, learning about polyvagal theory and the neuroscience of stress is also really, I never was taught that. And I think students really blossom when they learn that stuff. Oh, I didn't realize that when I'm having this fight with my mom, I'm dysregulated and maybe I should take a step back, right? Things like that, right? So.
No, absolutely. I love that you pick up on the being over doing and the compassion being the center of it. I've millions of more questions, but I'm sure that we're going to dig a little bit deeper into a lot of the questions that you pose to the audience in the community dialogue as well. So I'm kind of looking forward to that as well. But I do want to take some of the audience questions here. Stanley Lee says, how useful do you think nervous state is in the context of climate warfare? So they put this link in there, and I've just put it in the chat for you.
Okay, I'll have to look at that. I don't know about this book. I don't know this book. Oh, yeah. Objective fact is less important. Personal thoughts. Yeah, I think this is probably a really interesting book, and I'd like to read this book, so I haven't read it. But I'm going to run with what I think, just from that quick glance at it, what I think it might be saying. It's like, talk about fast reading. The identity politics aspect, the woke culture aspect, the tribalism stuff, the politics of outrage, the way that certain types of emotions get more circulated in media than others, the way the algorithms are designed to make us hate each other, does mean that things like expertise, science, the sort of like flagships of reason don't matter as much. Absolutely. I think that's what that book is trying to say. A recent book that has a sort of a similar argument that I'm in the middle of right now is Dougald Hines' At Work in the Ruins. And he really does an amazing treatment of how science has become basically a plastic concept in politics, and how undermining of democracy it is, and how undermining of the climate efforts it is. So yeah, short of not reading that book, I do think you're onto something there. And yeah, we don't talk about emotions as political as much as we should. So I love that the title of that book is making emotions political. Emotions have politics, and they're caused by politics, and they shape politics. There's a deep relationship between our emotions and politics, unlike we often think that politics happens in the public sphere and emotions happens in the private sphere of some therapy room, and your job is to manage them so that you can participate in capitalism better. I don't think that is a useful way of thinking about the role of emotions in politics. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have tons of questions and not enough time to go through all of them. So I'm going to go through them as fast as I can. This one is from an anonymous attendee. They say, you emphasize the role of pleasure, but isn't the emphasis on pleasure part of what has gotten us into the climate crisis in the first place?
Okay. Yes.
Isn't some of what is needed in the climate work is the interruption of pleasure-seeking behaviors, example, overconsumption?
This is such an important distinction, and I really appreciate you raising it. Adrian Ray Brown and, the whole tradition of, like, for example, Buddhist, Western Buddhist thought and mindfulness and even I would say, like, Stoicism, like the philosophy of Stoicism that is the most prominent today, would say that there's a distinction between hedonic pleasure, which is the sort of dopamine hit stuff that we're all addicted to. Like, that feels good, I'm just going to stay on this video game all night long, right? The sort of quick fixes, what we would call switches instead of seeds, right? So there's a switches of pleasure where I'm like, I am feeling uncomfortable right now. I don't like that news I just heard about the tsunami or the fire or the flood or this nation having to move because of climate change. I'm gonna just dive into some kind of pleasure as a solution, right? Whether that's shopping or whatever, right? Going to the spa, right? So this kind of notion of self-care as a hedonic pleasure, where all we're doing is trying to soothe ourselves from the discomfort of the reality we live in. That is not what I'm advocating for. And that's not what Adrian Ray Brown's advocating for. And that's not what the folks who are talking about the role of joy and pleasure and desire in any kind of social movement. What they're talking about is more like the eudaimonic kinds of pleasure, which has to do with a sense of purpose and a sense of solidarity in a collective. And it's interesting when you do research around what soothes people's climate anxiety, there's some assumptions made that action is the antidote to anxiety. But it turns out when you really dig into that research, it's not the action that solves the anxiety. It's the sense of being part of a collective. So that ancestor principle or that collectivity principle, or the great turning notion of solidarity and recognition of interconnection with the more than human world and each other, that turns out to be the solution to the anxiety. So that is a form of pleasure that's like planting a seed rather than flipping a switch. And that is more eudaimonic pleasure rather than hedonic pleasure. So there's some really great research out there. You can look at it that distinguish these types of pleasure and desire and say one is really the sort of like dopamine addictive culture kind of stuff that capitalism just makes money off of you because you don't like feeling uncomfortable, versus the kind of like longer term seeds that you plant for this richer interconnected life. That ends up being your source of pleasure. And that's what Adrian Ray Brown's talking about. The reason why there's an argument for that, why Adrian Ray Brown even says that, is because so much of the environmental movement has always been about sacrifice, deprivation, scarcity, giving up pleasures, being ascetic or whatever, right? So there's a sort of like scarcity mentality around most environmental normative claims about how we should live our lives. And you think about the students that don't even walk in the door to an environmental classroom because they know it's going to be depressing. Because we are animals, people don't like sticks, they like carrots, just like every other animal, right? And there are some people who are, that's not a black and white statement. Not everybody's like that. There's certainly exceptions to the rule, but in general, people are motivated by things that bring them coming back for more. And so the question becomes, how do you make an environmental movement or climate movement something that gives people the kinds of sense of satisfaction, joy, pleasure that makes them come back for more and keep doing it rather than just turning away towards those other kinds of dopamine hits? That's really the question. I don't know. Yeah. And there's a movement within the climate movement that says, let's make this movement fun, let's make this movement feel good. Let's make this movement about building the future we desire, about solutions, about coming together, about reconnecting. There's like so many riches to be had in the renunciation of this other way of life. And so instead of focusing on just the renunciation and the lack, the question is what's gained, right? What do we gain? What's the pleasure that we gain in doing that? And so focusing on the things that make people want to do it rather than, the reasons why people are like, I don't think I really want to give up X, Y, and Z, Yeah, it's a great question. Right. And the same goes for desire. Like in Buddhist thought, there's distinctions around desire, right? There's a desires, wholesome and unwholesome desires is how it's distinguished. And that might be helpful too.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we might have time for maybe one or two questions. So I wanted to ask you this, so I'm really happy that this anonymous audience has asked it. What are some of the practical ways you have been supporting students expand their zone or window of tolerance or resilience, and to explore and become more comfortable with the paradox and uncertainty?
Yeah. Doing Venn diagrams is really fun. So I mean, that's just it's fun. It's easy. You just make Venn diagrams. You explain ambiguity. You read some Vanessa Andreotti about binary attachment to binary thinking being kind of a colonial solutions oriented. She's against solutionism in her work, right? So we're not here for solutions. We're here for going way upstream to the cause of the original cause of the problem in the first place, which is these mindsets, to go back to Donella Meadows' work too. And so there's the, challenge and anything you can do to bring in, challenging black and white thinking. Then there's, the arguments, if you just explain how the window of tolerance works and go through ways that students have felt that way, triggered into their hypoarousal on a given day, right? I also do, and that then helps them become more aware. So how do we become more aware of when we're triggered so that we can have that pause that Viktor Frankl talks about between the stimulus and the response, where all of our power is, right? So how do we practice cultivating, and every time we get a stimulus, even if the stimulus is just, I feel a little bit cold, or I feel a fly on my nose, or whatever the stimulus is, before we react to it, can we choose to react to it? Is everything that we're doing a choice? Can we become more conscious of the fact that we're not just acting habitually in our lives, but we're making intentional decisions? Those are all mindfulness strategies that can be practiced. And there was one other that I was thinking about around expanding the window of tolerance. Yes. So one of the things I love to do with students is do two other things: an attention audit. So going through the day and just doing an audit of how they spent their attention and coming up with the data and showing it to each other and having each other talk about it. How are we spending our attention? What does this look like we want to have grow in the world, right? And what practical steps might we do to slowly shift even just a little bit? It's like, that idea of if you're on a boat in the ocean and you change your course of direction by just 1 degree, it seems really, really small, but over time it's really, really big, right? You're going to end up in a completely different place. I love that metaphor for thinking about small change. There's nudge psychology that also reinforces that small change actually really matters a lot. But how can we slightly change our habits that are going to have these big impacts down the road for us that put our attention in the places that we love? What are those things that we love? So diving right into the negative, so-called negative emotions, to then do the work of unpacking, what are we afraid of? What is it that we love that we're afraid is threatened by these things? What can we do to nurture that thing that we love instead of hem and haw about that which we are afraid about? So there's all kinds of strategies you can do to just walk through that. I also would recommend, you could get from the website I put there from the Decolonial Futures, you can get her deck of cards. She's got decks of cards where you can just pass out these decks of cards and have people talk about these really provocative, unanswerable questions with students. So yeah, I mean, that has to do with hospicing, or examining, I shouldn't use her term necessarily always, but examining the ways that we are perpetuating the systems that we claim that we don't want to exist anymore. And I think that work is a lifetime of work, and her cards make it kind of fun. So just some examples I'm thinking off the top of my head. Take any one of those questions and say, what's your, how are you going to be a better ancestor? Let's go. Let's talk about how to see yourself in this larger scheme if you don't already do that. I'm talking about people like me who definitely did not get taught the ancestor principle. And some people have really rich traditions of thinking about ancestor principle that they can teach the rest of the students, right? So maybe there's wisdom traditions that are evident or present in your classroom where students can teach each other. That's also a really great pedagogy. High impact practice pedagogy, where you acknowledge that there's wisdom and that students are not, it's against that sort of deficit pedagogy where students are empty vessels and you're just putting knowledge into them, but rather what knowledge do they come in around any of these questions? How do they cope? How their elders coped with setbacks, right? Can we learn from them?
Absolutely. I love that. Love that. And I mean, I would, in my own classroom, it's more about co-creating the learning community with the students, bringing them into the, as partners in the learning process. So I love that. Thank you. I have so many great questions in the Q&A, which I would love to ask you, but we are running out of time. But I think for the audience, if you would really like to discuss these further, your questions, if your questions haven't been answered or if had been, please join us in the community dialogue, which is a separate Zoom room where you will actually get to talk and interact with Sarah and others. So the link is in the chat for you right now. So we will be meeting there. I just really like to thank again the Sustainability Hub, the Student Health and Wellbeing, and especially the Equity Enhancement Fund at UBC for sponsoring and supporting us for this event. And special thank you to Sarah and all the audience for joining us. And we will see you in the Community Dialogue Zoom room, and the link is right there. So please copy and paste, and we will see you there in a bit. Thank you, everyone.